On this episode of the podcast, Todd speaks with author Stephan Guyenet.
All right, guys, this is Todd from Selfreport Strength and Conditioning, and I'm here today talking with Stephan Guyenet. He recently wrote a book. Well, I don't know how recently it was written. Recently released a book called The Hungry Brain, and I've actually been following Stephan's work for quite a long time now. I originally started reading his blog, which is called Whole Health Source, and he actually has his own personal site now, but the articles on Whole Health Source are still up. Probably 2008, 2009, something like that, when I was first starting to research the paleo diet and CrossFit and all that type of stuff when I had gotten into this type of training on my own. And I think actually Whole Health Source was linked to on a blog called Paleo Nutrition by a guy called Kurt Harris. I'm not sure if that's actually correct or not, or if that's where I first found it. But, you know, it's super interesting since at the time everything was all about food quality and paleo, and there was this whole primal community that was kind of growing, and there was a lot of great information in there. And then Stephan had a slightly different perspective since he has a background as an obesity researcher and a neuroscientist. So he was talking more about, you know, not just food quality and insulin and hormones and all that, but actually talking about the brain's role in regulating body fat. And that whole paradigm was much more, at least to me, valuable and explanatory than a purely, classic paleo diet paradigm or a low carb paradigm or anything like that. So the book that he just released really goes into this whole framework for understanding why different diets potentially work. You know, why can people have good results on a low carb diet and a Dean Ornish low fat diet and a paleo diet and Atkins diet and all that, since they're all acting on essentially the same mechanism, which is the brain. So that's kind of a rough background of my history with your work, Stephan, and at least a framework for understanding where you're coming from. So I figured I'd let you at least start with kind of a brief summary of the main concepts of your book before we really start to, get into the weeds and talk about some of the details here.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Good to be here. So essentially, just to dive right into the premise of my book, the premise is that no one wants to overeat. We know that calorie intake is, the primary, practically the only, or I shouldn't say calorie intake, but calorie balance is the primary determinant of body fatness, almost the exclusive determinant of body fatness. So we know that eating more calories than you're burning is, driving and sustaining body fat gain. And nobody wants to overeat, right? Nobody wants to eat more calories than they need to maintain their weight, and to do that for years and years, develop obesity and develop chronic disease issues as a result. Yet that's exactly what most people do in this country. And so where's that disconnect between what we want to do, our conscious rational goals, and our actual behaviors? And so we know that the brain generates all behaviors. The brain generates all behaviors related to eating and everything else, in terms of the amount of food you're eating, in terms of the type of food that you're eating. And so it's really the obvious place to look if we want to understand eating behavior. And yet it's been really severely underemphasized, I would say, in conversations about eating behavior and body fatness and physical activity, energy expenditure as well. And I think that my book is trying to correct that gap by explaining the brain circuits that determine food selection and the amount that we eat, as well as other aspects of behavior. And essentially what it boils down to is that the reason we overeat, even though we don't want to, is because there are circuits in our brain that are non-conscious, intuitive brain circuits that drive us to do so. And so these are the circuits that generate our impulses like hunger, that generate impulses like satiety, that generate impulses like the seductiveness of food, how much how much we enjoy food, how much we want food, how much we crave food. And these are all things that were wired millions of years ago. I mean, these are brain systems that you see in rodents as well. Very, very analogous brain systems doing very, very similar things. So these things have been around for tens of millions of years, and they evolved in a very specific context that allowed them to promote the survival and reproduction of our distant ancestors. So essentially, they're in the wrong context today. And I would say that one of the reasons why we haven't really focused on the brain very much up until this point is because it's kind of complicated, you know. We were still learning a lot about it. There was still a lot that we didn't know. Of course, there still is a lot that we don't know. And not only that, but it's often hard to translate to the public because of the complexity. And so it's a lot easier to translate competing hypotheses like it's all about carbs or it's all about sugar. Those are very compact, concise hypotheses that are very easy to communicate to the public. And so my book is an attempt to remedy that by, you know, taking my best stab at making the neuroscience of body fatness and eating behavior accessible to the public in a way that will give people a real, more kind of profound first principles understanding of why we overeat, why our body holds on to excess fat, and if there's anything we can do about that.
Yeah, that's a super helpful summary just to at least get some of the baseline concepts going. So I think that one of the things that you mentioned that is really interesting, right, is this concept of energy balance, calories in, calories out, which, you know, depending on which school of diet blogging you come from, right, there's some people who claim that's the only thing that matters, and there's other people who claim that a calorie is not a calorie. You know, Gary Taubes has a book called Good Calories, Bad Calories, where he claims that, you know, the calorie equation is almost tautological in that it tells you nothing. It's just defining itself by its own terms, right? And that something else is actually regulating body fatness. And I think what's really powerful about your explanation is that, you know, it's almost like a third way. It doesn't have to be low carb diet. It doesn't have to be a low fat diet. It doesn't have to be, you know, aggressive calorie counting and counting every single thing that you are putting into your mouth. It's actually more about understanding how the human organism is going to regulate its own body fat set point, right? So I think that analogy you use of a thermostat is one of the most powerful and helpful things to think about how to potentially change someone's body fatness. Can you elaborate on that analogy a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, I to take a step back here and just focus on calories for a moment as well, and then I'll answer your question. I think one thing that's really important to realize that can sometimes be difficult to communicate to a general audience is that in the scientific community, calories, at least among obesity researchers who are really knowledgeable about calorie balance and body fatness, calories are understanding calories is a tool and a mechanism for understanding body fatness for understanding the relative contribution of diet and physical activity and metabolic processes. It's not really an explanation of the ultimate cause of obesity. So, for example, saying that excess calories are required for fat to accumulate and obesity to occur is true, but that doesn't really tell you what caused the excess calories to accumulate inside the body. So it's kind of a way of getting a toehold on the mechanism of what's going on and starting to understand what's going on, but it doesn't really tell you like what foods it was that caused that, or whether it was more food or more physical activity, or those sorts of questions have to be sorted out independently. What it is it's a link in the causal chain from some, ultimate first cause to the accumulation of excess body fatness. So just to kind of clear that up. So the body fat set point, I agree with you. I think it's a very important concept. So just to kind of give a broad overview of some of the things that the brain does. a lot of the physiological processes the brain regulates. So the brain regulates behavior, obviously, how you move your body, but it also regulates a lot of physiology in your body, how your body works. Things like your heart rate and things like your breathing rate and your levels of certain ions in your blood pressure, and those things are all regulated around. Probably the best example actually is body temperature. The brain regulates body temperature in a way that can be described as homeostatic. And what that means is that it tries to maintain your body temperature at a certain specific set point, just like your thermostat would maintain your home temperature at a certain specific set point. So a thermostat, if your thermostat's set at 65 and the temperature goes to 63, your thermostat's going to sense that and it's going to kick in the heat. Or if it goes up to 67, it'll kick in the air conditioning. So your body works the same way, and it's really, really good at it. I mean, it keeps your body temperature within like a degree Fahrenheit, at least your core body temperature. And the way it does that is by using sensors on your skin and in your core to detect changes and impending changes in core temperature. And it integrates all that information and it uses it to select behavioral and physiological responses designed to prevent changes in temperature. So it will constrict the blood vessels in your skin. It will cause your hair to stand up. It will cause you to adopt postures that conserve heat. It'll cause you to shiver. It'll activate your brown fat, or conversely, it'll make you want a glass of ice water. There are many different mechanisms, both physiological and behavioral, that it engages together to maintain your core body temperature. And that strategy is very, very effective. It can keep your core body temperature to within a degree when the weather could be wildly varying. The outdoor temperature that you're in could be wildly varying, but your internal temperature is the same. So that's a process called homeostasis. And the brain does that for a bunch of different things. And a lot of that regulation, a lot of that homeostatic regulation occurs in a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which is a small, old region of the brain that is kind of in the middle of the underside of your brain, near where your optic nerves cross. And one of the things the hypothalamus regulates homeostatically is your level of body fatness. And this is actually very similar to how your body regulates temperature. So, or how your thermostat regulates temperature. So there's a certain set point that it wants to maintain. And just like it wants to maintain your body temperature around 98.6, for each individual, there's a certain body fat set point that it tries to maintain, which generally we're currently at, unless we're actively trying to diet at the moment. And it measures your level of body fatness using a hormone called leptin that is secreted by fat tissue in proportion to its size. And so the more fat tissue you have, the more leptin you have, and your brain detects that, uses it as a measure, and uses it to regulate responses that in turn control your fat mass. And so if you try to diet and your fat mass starts going down, your leptin goes down, your hypothalamus hears about it, and it starts kicking in this behavioral and physiological program to get the fat back. And so on the behavioral side, you have an increase in calorie intake, or at least an increase in eating drive that occurs due to increased hunger, increased cravings for calorie-rich foods. On the physiological side, you will have a reduction in metabolic rate due to a reduction in thyroid hormone, reduction in energy expenditure that occurs due to physical activity. And so there's this coherent behavioral and physiological program that your brain engages to try to get that fat back and to bring it back to that body fat set point. And I think this is a really, really important thing for people to understand. Like there's all kinds of theories out there about what regulates the levels of fat in the human body. This is the only, I want to emphasize this, this is the only system in the human body that has been clearly shown to regulate body fatness. There is no other system, not insulin or anything else, that has been shown to regulate body fatness powerfully in humans. And I should qualify that because insulin plugs into the same pathway a little bit, but it doesn't work at all like the insulin obesity advocates suggest. So this is the primary reason, or at least one of two reasons, the other being just adherence to a weight loss diet, why weight loss is so difficult.
Sure. So essentially, you're trying to lose weight is almost like, having the thermostat in your house set to 67 degrees and starting a fire and turning on all the lights and turning on the oven and the stove and opening the door up and everything like that. But, the air conditioning is pumping the whole time, just trying to fight you every step of the way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I would put the analogy a little bit different. I would say it's like in winter, having your thermostat set to 65 and having all the windows open. So you're trying to lower the temperature, but your homeostatic system is fighting it and fighting it and fighting it. And that's exactly right. So what does that mean? What are the implications of that? The implications are that you opening the windows, that is your conscious, rational brain trying to make decisions like eating less that are trying to accomplish your conscious, rational goal of being leaner or being healthier or whatever it is you're trying to lose weight for. And the thermostat pumping out heat is your intuitive, non-conscious brain that is ramping up your hunger and lowering your calorie expenditure, making you feel cold and sluggish, giving you cravings, and fighting your conscious intentions the entire way. And that response is very, very persuasive. And we see that in studies of almost any type of diet style. People tend to regain weight over time after they lose. So these non-conscious brain processes that try to get the fat back are very persuasive, and they tend to wear us down over time.
Sure. So one of the questions that I had while reading your book was based on a little footnote you had when describing this body fat set point, which is that there's debate, at least in the research community, amongst whether there's an actual body fat set point, almost like a body temperature, or if it's a variety of different processes that are all kind of, balancing each other out, and they just happen to settle on a specific set point. And I thought that was really interesting. Do you have any more insight into what's actually going on there, or at least what the competing hypotheses are?
Yeah, so I think that it's a really interesting question, and I don't feel very strongly about it. I think the fundamental observation that, okay, so set point is like your thermostat. There is one number that never changes, and that's always what the thermostat's trying to defend. I think the observation that the settling point people are trying to account for is the fact that the set point can change, or I can call it the defended level of body fat. That doesn't imply set point or settling point, but just that something is defended by the brain. It can change, so it can go up or it can go down. And so I think that whether you want to call it a settling point where there are different forces that are contributing to it that can cause it to shift, or whether you want to say it's a unitary set point, but that set point can be changed by other incoming signals, I don't really feel very strongly about that. What I will say is that Kevin Hall, I mean, you can distinguish between set point and settling point using control theory modeling, and Kevin Hall has done that. And basically, the set point model is the only one that can really explain the evidence. However, I think you have to qualify that by acknowledging that the set point can change. In individuals over time, people can, slowly their comfortable weight can slowly increase, or if they change their diet dramatically, their comfortable weight can decrease, and they can essentially lose body fat without having to actively restrict their calorie intake. Their appetite settles at a different place and they feel good at a lower level of body fat. And that's kind of what their brain starts to defend. So I think I don't really feel very strongly about what kind of terminology is used. Although if I want to be precise, I think that the set point is probably a better description of what's happening.
Sure. So just to clarify for people listening, set point would essentially be actually the brain defending either a specific weight or a specific level of body fatness, whereas settling point would be the brain ends up defending either a specific weight or a specific level of body fatness, but it's only actually defending a variety of other factors like, say, appetite, activity level, and all that end up sort of emergently creating a body fat set point. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great explanation of it.
Yeah.
And I mean, both ideas make a lot of sense. But there is definitely a homeostatic system in the hypothalamus that is defending specifically body fatness. So it's not just a bunch of other things that don't really have to do with body fatness that are converging. It is possible that system that is specifically defending body fatness is kind of like converging with other signals from other places to determine ultimately your body fatness. But that doesn't change the fact that there definitely is a homeostatic system that is specifically trying to regulate body fatness.
Sure. And I think you mentioned, was it research by Kevin Hall that kind of uses a statistical model to figure out if it's a set point or a settling point? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Because I mean, these different. This is control theory, and the different forms of control have different signatures, and you can basically test what happens in humans and see which signature corresponds best to those. And the set point model best explains the observed evidence.
Got it. Cool. I'll have to look that study up, and we can post a link to that in the show notes and blog posts associated with this as well.
Sounds good. I can send you the study.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great. So one thing that you started to mention a little bit is the hypothalamus and leptin and all that, and it seems that you actually did research specifically on this hypothalamic injury, which can potentially lead to this state of dysregulating this body fat set point. Can you elaborate just a little bit on how you think that may be initially caused and what's actually going on there?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a tough question because the truth is I don't know exactly what's going on. I have hypotheses, but just to give some context, basically, this system that regulates body fatness, in the book I call it the lipostat. It's it can the set point around which it regulates your body fatness can change over time. I mean, people can gain weight, people can lose weight, and not just because they're deliberately eating more calories or deliberately eating fewer calories. Their actual comfortable, stable weight when they're just eating to fullness and doing their normal stuff can change. And I think people are pretty familiar with the fact that tends to happen as people get older. In the United States, we tend to gain fat. And so the question is, how does that happen? Because basically what you see, and I think this is very important to emphasize, people with obesity are not just lean people who eat more food. People with obesity are physiologically and neurobiologically different than lean people. Their body fat regulation system is actively defending a higher level of body fatness. So if you take a person with obesity and you cut their calories, they will lose weight. Doesn't matter what type of calories they are, they will lose weight. And you can bring them down in body fatness to a level where they're no longer obese. But if you compare them physiologically and metabolically to a person who is at that same level of body fatness who didn't previously lose weight, you're going to see that they're very, very different. They have the signature of their brain and body fighting hard against that previous weight loss and trying to regain the weight. And that's what you'll see, is that they do generally regain it. So what is it that causes that change of state from a lipostat that's defending leanness to a lipostat that is defending obesity? So when we look in the hypothalamus, which again is that part of the brain that regulates body fatness, excuse me, what we see is that in obesity there's a specific signature that occurs in the hypothalamus, and this happens in laboratory animals. We also see signs of it happening in humans. And that is a signature of cellular stress in the hypothalamus. So we see inflammation. Some people have reported another type of cellular stress called endoplasmic reticulum stress. We see changes in stem cell populations and replenishment of neurons in that area that are altered. Basically, and we see changes in non-neuronal cell types like astrocytes and microglia. Those are supporting cell types that manage inflammation and kind of support the metabolism of neurons. Basically, you don't have to remember all these details, but the point is that there is a broad stress response in that part of the hypothalamus that we think has to do with these changes in how body fatness is regulated. So what you see in people with obesity is they have something called leptin resistance. And what that means is that it takes more leptin for their brain to be satisfied that they have enough body fatness. So basically, it would be like changing the thermometer in your thermostat so that your thermostat it's 65 in your house, but your thermostat is measuring the temperature at 40 degrees. And so it's gonna keep pumping up the heat until it's 25 degrees higher, till it's like 90 degrees in there, and that's where it's gonna feel satisfied. It's gonna think it's 65 when it's 90, and that's what it's gonna regulate around. So basically, people with obesity, they need more leptin and therefore more body fatness for their brain to feel quote unquote satisfied and to not initiate that starvation response that happens when you're below your set point. And so we think that loss of sensitivity to leptin has to do with this stress response in the hypothalamus. But the truth is, there's still a lot we don't know about that. I mean, this is a topic that is under active investigation, and we don't really know exactly what leptin resistance is on a neurobiological level in the brain. We know that people with obesity require higher levels of leptin to feel comfortable at their weight, to feel like they're at their set point, but we don't know exactly where in the signaling pathways of the brain that quote unquote resistance occurs. We don't really know the mechanism of that yet. But we suspect it may have to do with the cellular stress response. And so where does that come from?
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, I figured that one was coming. And again, there's a lot of uncertainty here. There are hypotheses. I mean, what we see is that when we give experimental animals calorie-dense, refined foods, they tend to develop this stress response in the hypothalamus, and they gain fat, and their body fat set point goes up. We see that same thing in humans who eat calorie-dense, refined foods. And in our studies, by the way, I want to emphasize that some of our studies were in humans, not just in rodents, and we saw signs of this cellular stress response occurring in live humans using MRI, as well as post-mortem tissues using staining techniques. So we saw a correlation between these cellular stress responses and obesity in humans as well.
And to
Um,
interrupt for a second, in the book, I think there's a really good illustration of that, the literal visible difference in terms of what the neurons actually look like in an inflamed and stressed hypothalamus versus a normal one.
yeah, and those were actually the supporting cell types rather than neurons, so the
Sure.
astrocytes and microglia. But yeah, there's an illustration of how those change. Um, so like I said, we don't know exactly what it is, but it definitely has a lot to do with the diet that you eat. And when you feed animals this calorie dense refined food, it's high in fat, very calorie dense. It has sugar and refined carbohydrate in it. And you can't really pin, some people would say, oh, it's the sugar, or oh, it's the fat, or oh, it's the lack of fiber. The truth is, you can't really pin it on one thing. Researchers have dissected these diets up, down, and sideways, and it basically takes the whole package to cause the full effect. So the high calorie density and the high levels of isolated fat, typically lard, that's a major component. Having the sugar and refined carbohydrate definitely exacerbates it. The lack of fiber exacerbates it. The calorie density is a big part of it. So all of that kind of comes together to cause this. And I think ultimately some combination of excess calories and low diet quality is what comes together in the hypothalamus to cause this leptin resistance effect. And just briefly to follow up on that, there's also lifestyle elements. It's not just about diet. So, for example, physical activity can attenuate these effects.
Sure. And so, just to clarify, there have been studies done that attempt to create the same level of hypothalamic damage through simple high calorie diets that aren't quite as inflammatory, for example, and it's not as bad. Or diets that are extremely high in sugar but not necessarily as high in calories, and it's not as bad. Is that correct?
Um, so sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I was just trying to clarify. I think you said that attempts have been made to recreate that type of hypothalamic damage with different versions of diets that could be fattening, whether that's high calorie but not as inflammatory, or high calorie but lower in sugar. But it seems to be the combination of all of those factors that actually create the damage. Is that correct?
Well, I think that specifically with regard to hypothalamic damage, not a lot of research has been done on that, but there has been a lot done on what aspects of these diets are fattening.
Okay, got it.
And yeah, yeah. So um, basically the the current diet that we typically use to fatten rodents and that we used in my research to fatten rodents has all of those elements. And if you subtract some of those elements, you get a diet that's not as fattening.
Mhm. Sure. And then the assumption would be that if it's less fattening, there's less damage, but that hasn't necessarily been specifically tested.
Correct.
Okay, cool. Yeah, someone should do those studies.
Yeah.
Too bad you quit the research game, right? Um, cool. So, I mean, I think that gives a pretty good outline of, I guess, the overall hypothesis of your book and your work here. And I have a bunch of questions for you that might be more relevant specifically to, say, an active population who is trying to go from, say, the 85th percentile of leanness to the 95th percentile of leanness, right? Not necessarily people who are obese, but people who would like to lose body fat either to look better or perform better. Um,
hmm
and I know that speculation is probably not your forte, but I don't know, since maybe you're not an active research scientist anymore, you can indulge a little bit. So I think that a bunch of the concepts in this book are really interesting and potentially may seem at odds with a lot of common, I guess, nutritional coaching practices within the CrossFit community for both competitors and like normal athletes. But to me, I actually think there's alignment there, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
hmm
Are you feeling familiar with the concept of reverse dieting at all?
Um, Very lightly. I read that email you sent me, but
Sure.
do you want to explain it again?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I don't do a lot of nutritional coaching or consulting or anything like that, but I know enough to answer questions if people have them, and we'll try to help people out when I can. But I usually, refer people to other folks for this. But a super common thing that I see is that, especially for people training consistently, um, you know, 4 or 5 times a week at high intensity and volume, is that if they do a food log, they seem to be dramatically under eating relative to their body weight and activity level, right? I mean, you'll get stuff like a 150-pound female doing CrossFit 5 times a week who is eating 1,200 calories per day, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
just makes no sense, and she should be starving, right? And there's a lot of issues with self-reported food intake stuff, but I don't think these people are necessarily lying on their food logs in that sense. But what often happens anecdotally is that if you have this person increase their daily caloric intake, they actually get much better results over time. They tend to actually lose weight if they're eating more calories on a consistent daily basis. Now, my own thoughts on what's going on here, but do you have any thoughts about what might actually be happening there?
Yeah, that's definitely a puzzling phenomenon. There's it's really hard to get accurate data from self-report on how many calories people are eating, and it's not necessarily that they're lying. It's just that the human brain is biased to report things aspirationally. So if we feel like we should be doing something in a certain way, we tend to, whether consciously or not, we tend to report things in a way that seems more favorable to those aspirations. And this is something that you see. It's been very, very well documented in the obesity research literature that people underreport. Almost anyone will underreport their calorie intake, but the more the heavier a person is, the more that they will underreport their calorie intake. And obviously, that's not specifically relevant to what you're talking about here,
Mhm.
just a general fact. But yeah, 1,200 calories is really not plausible for a 150-pound woman who's doing CrossFit 5 times a week. So what could explain this discrepancy where okay, so let me take a step back, and I'll
Sure.
divide this into two parts. One is the discrepancy between calorie intake and how many calories a person, should be needing. And I think that's probably just the problems with self-report. Uh, we have extensive evidence on the relationship between calorie intake and physical activity and body fatness level, and it's there's certain things that are just, I would say, very implausible, that you hear reported a lot in the diet and fitness community, and I think a lot of that can be explained by the inaccuracy of self-report. The second thing is this idea of increasing apparent calorie intake and people losing weight. Um, I don't really know how to explain that. So a couple of things. First of all, most of the evidence that we have on calorie requirements and body fatness and the relationship between the two does not come from highly trained athletes. So I don't think we have necessarily a lot of um, evidence that's specifically in highly trained athletes who are exercising at very high levels of physical activity. So it doesn't seem very likely to me that there's some like weird reverse calorie effect in there, but I can't say for certain that that doesn't happen. As far as what else is going on, whether maybe, you know, bumping up calorie intake just allows people to, I don't know. I don't really know how to explain it, I
Yeah.
guess.
I mean, my thought around this, because it's fascinating and bizarre that it seems to happen, right? And I've seen it with a few people, and what I think is happening is actually a an adherence piece, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
that that this person is potentially actually eating 1,200 calories, 4 days a week, and their lipostat freaks out, and then they have a few drinks and eat a whole pizza, and then get back on the wagon and go back to their 1,200 calorie diet, but that their overall weekly caloric intake is much higher because they don't realize how often they're actually, quote unquote, breaking their diet and sort of giving into the demands of their lipostat. And that the increased caloric intake actually reduces the overall stress on their system, makes them able to perform better in the gym, have less hunger, etc., so that they're actually more compliant to the diet over, 2 months, when you can actually see change. And I have no idea if that's actually what's going on, but that's my initial thought process on what might be happening there.
Yeah, that seems very plausible. I think that the explanation, the idea that actually increasing calorie intake, actually increasing overall calorie intake would lower body fat, I think is pretty difficult to reconcile with what we know about the relationship between those two things. I'm not going to say it's impossible because, like I said, there's an evidence gap for highly trained athletes, but it seems pretty hard to believe. So yeah, I think the explanation that you said seems pretty plausible to me.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to see actual research on it, but it's always tough to get research on highly trained athletes, that actually controls for everything. But yeah, the potential change in caloric intake over a month might be net negative with a higher daily calorie intake if you pull out all the indulgences and breaking the diet and snacking from just being starving.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Yeah. And then based upon that, another question I have has to do with the concept of a cheat meal, especially relative to, the holiday weight gain concept that you actually discuss in the book. So to give kind of background on my question, right? A lot of popular diets advocate having a cheat meal, right? Essentially one day a week where you do whatever you want. If you're on a low carb diet, that you eat a bunch of pizza and donuts and cake and all that type of stuff on a Friday night, right? Or if you're, bodybuilders have been doing cyclical ketogenic diets where they're in ketosis most of the time, and then they have extremely high carbohydrate weekends to allegedly keep their thyroid humming along and all that type of stuff. But you cite a lot of research that shows that, people tend to actually gain most of their weight surrounding the holidays where they're picking out, essentially. Do you have any thoughts on reconciling those two concepts, or do you think that they're unreconcilable?
I mean, I think there's really, to my knowledge, there's not any evidence that refeeds or cheat days or that sort of thing has an effect on metabolism that is independent of average calorie intake. Does that make sense? What I'm saying here? So I guess whether you eat those same number of the average number every day, or whether you eat less some days and then a couple days you bump it up, I'm not aware of evidence that there's any difference in thyroid or leptin or any of that stuff between those two scenarios. I'm not saying that there is no difference. I'm just saying I'm not aware of evidence. But I think, as someone who has designed a weight loss program, and one that does include a, so-called cheat day or free day is what I like to call it. I think that what it boils down to more than anything is adherence. So, and I'm not saying this necessarily applies to like bodybuilders, because I think they're like a different level of motivation than most people.
And we're also running into issues with, extra hormones being thrown into the system and all that type of stuff too. But
right. So I'm not sure this really speaks to them as much, but adherence is huge. Adherence is one of the two main factors that undermines weight loss success. And if you can have just a day a week where you can let that pressure valve release a little bit and eat the stuff you want to eat, I think that just helps you stick with it over time. And not just eat the stuff you want to eat, but do it and not feel guilty about it because it's part of the program, So I think it really helps with adherence. But I think a second point is that there's a difference between holiday overeating and having a free day or a cheat day. Like, at least in the context of what I'm familiar with my program and other weight loss programs, and that is that you're not supposed to be pigging out on pizza and ice cream. You're supposed to be eating the types of foods that you want to eat, but trying to pay attention to your signals of satiety and regulating your food intake and stopping when you're full. And also, in the case of my program, avoiding your worst problem foods, the things that you know you're going to just completely lose control around, because that's not productive. So, I mean, I think what you're getting at is, because in my book I talk about how overeating itself probably, or I hypothesize that overeating itself leads to a gradual ratcheting up of the set point that causes us to increase our set point and defend that for long periods of time, possibly forever. And that's what you see around the holidays. People gain a little bit each year and they don't really lose it all. They don't lose what they gained, and they just kind of ratchet up their set point every year from that period of stuffing their faces. I think if you're doing that in the context of a diet where you're in overall negative energy balance and you're not like hugely pigging out, I doubt it's going to have that kind of effect because you're still in the context of a negative energy balance.
Sure. And there's probably some individual variation as well in terms of, how much does periodic overfeeding episode actually adjust an individual's lipostat, right? Because I mean, you also cite research where some people, you take a cohort of people and you overfeed them dramatically by thousands of calories per day, and some people gain, 25 pounds over a few weeks, and other people gain two.
Yeah, there's huge individual variability in all of this stuff. And some people are just never going to gain fat no matter what they do, or at least under any reasonable conditions, they're not going to gain fat because they're just resistant to it. Other people, if they overeat, it all goes in the fat tissue and they're very susceptible. But I mean, there's variability like this in any system you want to look at. In the system that regulates body fatness, the system that regulates appetite, that regulates macronutrient preferences, the system that regulates our cravings, all of that stuff is genetically influenced. And I'm not like just speculating here. This has actually been studied. All of that stuff is strongly genetically influenced, and so different people will have different susceptibilities, and their body weight challenges or lack thereof can come from differences in different elements of that system. But generally, the genetic variability that causes people to defend different levels of body fatness occurs via the brain.
Sure. So I want to zoom out a little bit. We've been kind of in the weeds talking about, some practical applications of this stuff, and then the details of different mechanisms of brain injury and all that type of stuff. But I think what's really interesting about all this is that, we have a super complicated, emergent phenomena here that has a ton of competing explanations, all of which, someone can cite 25 different studies and make a pretty compelling case for. How do you actually think about a problem like this or attempt to sort through information, right? Not just about this, but in general.
Yeah. That's a really tough question. So I would say that it depends very much on the particulars of the situation, but I would say that there are some general principles that you can follow. One of them is to look for unbiased evidence. So, for example, and I don't mean like this person is less biased than that person. There are certain experimental designs that are inherently unbiased because they don't start with a hypothesis. So, for example, a genome-wide association study is a type of genetic study where they just take a bunch of people and they have some particular thing they're interested in, like cardiovascular disease susceptibility or body mass index or whatever, and they say, how does this trait, such as body mass index, associate with differences in genes in people? And then you can get associations. You could say, well, at this specific location on chromosome 5, you see that there's an association with body mass index. And then you can get a lot of these different signals, and then you can say, well, all these sites of genetic variability, what are they doing? We know that they're affecting body fatness. What kind of processes are these? And so then you get an unbiased picture of the physiological processes that are involved in body fatness, because all those processes were identified without any prior knowledge or hypotheses about what might be causing obesity. And what you see when you do that is that a lot of those genes, disproportionately, those genes are acting on the brain, and especially on pathways that are known by researchers already known through other research to regulate body fatness. So that's one example of trying to find experimental designs that are unbiased and extract information from those to just kind of set your sights in the right general direction. I guess let me see if I can come up with any other ideas here. I think that if I'm going into a specific topic and I know nothing about it, what I generally do is I start with looking up review papers in the scientific literature and just kind of getting my bearings. And then I will start to dig into primary studies, and I'll start to look at the quality of those primary studies and see how well they support the conclusions. And then if I'm doing something important, like writing a book, I'll try to speak to researchers and evaluate their arguments. But I'm having a hard time coming up with other like specific advice. I think it's basically there's a collection of tricks that collectively are science and rational thinking that it's kind of hard to sum up concisely.
Sure. So to maybe get even more specific and tactical on some of that, if you're looking for review papers, I mean, do you go on Google Scholar or ResearchGate, or do you have a bunch of university accounts? What do you actually look for?
I generally go on Google Scholar. Google Scholar has some tools that make it easier to do literature searches, and they make it very easy for you to see who has cited a paper, and they have a related papers search term as well that pulls up papers by the same author or on the same subject. Those things make it a lot easier to do literature searches, and their search algorithm is just better than the other options. So I typically stick to Google Scholar.
Sure. Yeah, that's helpful. So you'd essentially pick a topic and search for, say, hypothalamic inflammation meta review or something, and see what comes up and start digging.
Yeah.
Cool. So I got one more question for you, and then we'll wrap up so we can be respectful of your time here. Something that I think is super interesting is, I listen to a bunch of podcasts coming out of Silicon Valley, and they talk a lot about different biotech stuff and all these potential innovations coming. I know you're kind of out of the research game, but if you had, unlimited funds or access to all these new technologies, what do you think would be the next step in terms of actually studying this phenomenon that you've, written this book about? Like what would you like to see someone do to figure out, the best thing to start to crack this code and be able to implement something that's going to help people out?
I think there's a couple things that have to be done. One of them is to understand this process in the brain that causes a lean person to become a person with obesity. And we know it has something to do with diet and lifestyle, and we know in broad strokes what at least some of the diet and lifestyle things are, that contribute to that, but we never really systematically investigated it. And we're just starting to get the tools where we can start to look at this stuff using some of the tools that my colleagues at the University of Washington developed, and that allow us to non-invasively look in the hypothalamus and see and look at these processes. But you can, I mean, it would be really interesting to see systematic investigation of the dietary factors that contribute to this process of defense of elevated level of body fatness. This is something that's been done to an extent in rodents, but it's never been done in humans. All we have is very indirect evidence. So I think that's one thing that would be very, very useful, is to kind of systematically start to pick apart the diet and lifestyle factors that are contributing to this process that we know is absolutely central and essential to the state of obesity. I think another thing that we need to do is, the truth is, we already have, I truly believe, I feel very confident that we have enough information currently to stop the obesity epidemic. Not necessarily make all people who are currently obese lean, but definitely cause future generations to not become obese. And the problem is, how do you actually get people to do those things? It's not so much how do you prevent obesity, it's how do you get people to actually do the things that prevent obesity. And I think that's where we are sorely lacking in tools. And there's a fundamental problem here, and that is that the human brain has certain impulses, certain instincts that are very difficult to fight using, conscious tools, conscious rational tools and willpower, and very difficult to fight using public health measures, at least as they're currently used. So having more information on behavior change at both the individual level and at the level of communities and nations, I think is really possibly the most important thing that we need right now.
Sure, yeah, it's not a lack of information that is not resulting in the outcomes that we want. It's something else.
Yeah, yeah.
Something else. So, Stephan, thanks a lot for taking the time to chat with me here. I read your book and wrote down a bunch of questions. So, it's great that I get to call you up on Skype and just start to run through all the questions I wrote down while reading.
Yeah, my pleasure, Todd.
Yeah, so the book is called The Hungry Brain. It's fantastic. I read it over the last few days. I think I said this to you in email. Stephan's former blog called Whole Health Source has a bunch of great articles on it, specifically one on the insulin hypothesis of obesity. So especially folks who are, kind of in that low carb world, I probably send that to someone every few months, just like, hey, you should actually read this, since I know you're playing around with ketosis and all that type of stuff. So I love that article. I love that former blog of yours. What else you got going on? Where else should people check in with you and follow your stuff?
Yeah, so my new blog is at stephanguyenet.com. That's StephanGuyenet.com. Twitter is WHSource. And I periodically give talks and write articles. I'm going to be at the Ancestral Health Symposium this year.
It's in Seattle, yeah?
Yeah, it's in Seattle this year. And I occasionally post lectures to my YouTube channel. I have one that I'm probably going to post pretty soon here as well.
What's the username for that?
That's a good question. I don't actually know.
Well, you could send that.
So long.
Yeah, you could send that to me too, and we'll post a link to it.
Okay, cool.
What about you mentioned you have a weight loss plan that folks can follow online. I know that a lot of people are always looking for nutrition consulting and diet templates and all that type of stuff. But if they they resonate with what you're talking about, where do they go to find that?
Yeah, so my business partner Dan Party and I, designed a program called the Ideal Weight Program, and that is available through dansplan.com. And we are just about to roll out a new version of it, which I'm really excited. It's going to be a course-based program that it dovetails with the book, and it focuses on the 6 areas that I talk about in the last chapter of my book as levers for regulating body fatness. So I'm really excited about that, and the program is going to be a whole lot cooler when it comes out in a month or two. And you'll be able to find that through Dan's Plan, and which is going to be Human OS. And by the way, folks who purchase the program now get grandfathered into the new version.
There you go. So a deal you can't pass up. Great scientific principles with some understanding of adherence and psychology to get people what they want.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you, Todd.